Welcome to Breaking Woke, how to identify, debunk, and dismantle politically correct ideas. Hi, my name is Douglas Kruger. I'm the author of the global new book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. Quick definitions. What's the difference? Liberal, conservative, progressive, libertarian, leftist, right-wing. These are broad working definitions only, just to give you an introduction to what the ideologies are and how to understand the landscape. The term liberal first. If a person had to ask me, are you a liberal? The next question I would ask would be, do you mean classical or progressive? There is a massive difference. I'd be comfortable with the former, absolutely not with the latter. I write entire books about the problem with that. So a classical liberal is defined by minimal political involvement and maximum individual freedom. Perhaps best summed up by that well-known phrase, I may not agree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. The progressive liberal of today, by contrast, does many things that are the antithesis of that original definition. It's closer to, I'm deeply offended and therefore you can't say that. Where the classical liberal believes in maximum individual liberty under the rule of law, the progressive liberal tends to do the opposite in a bid to get on board with modern identity politics. And what's wrong with that? Well, the problem with that is that it doesn't judge individuals on their merit, but instead sees individuals primarily as part of their group identity. In other words, you're not James Smith, an individual with a unique history and intellect. You are James Smith, a black man, and black comes first. You are primarily a group and secondarily yourself. This is the reverse, of course, of Martin Luther King's judge me by the content of my character, not by the color of my skin idea. Under this framework, you literally begin by saying, tell me your race and then I will tell you where you stand. It is the opposite of justice, and it has moved extremely far away from the classical liberal concept. Next, the Libertarian. This is a group for which I have much respect. Though I'm not quite one, there are many things about them that I admire, and many good ideas within this camp of thought. The libertarian ideal is a bare minimum of government. It is total freedom. It is very much do whatever you want because you, the individual, are free. Where I think it starts to go wrong is in supporting movements like the defunding of the police in favor of every individual simply defending their own lives with their own guns. That was the Wild West. It was violent. Sure, it was free, but it was violent, and that does not lead to maximum human prosperity. From where I'm standing, I believe that maximum prosperity is achieved under a maximum of individual liberty under the rule of objective law. You need those together. Now, that's taking libertarianism to extremes. Not every libertarian believes in that. However, during the Defund the Police movement, you did see a lot of libertarian voices agreeing with it, not on any ethical grounds, but rather on the simple assumption that all police are oppressive, that all institutions are oppressive. I don't quite go along with that. I think that's a bridge too far. Then you arrive at conservatives. I would define myself as one. There is much overlap with the classical liberal. In fact, the value systems today, your modern conservative is essentially the same thing as the classical liberal. They are defined by evolution, not revolution. What does that mean? The conservative prefers peace and stability based on sound social structures. Where there are deficiencies, where there are problems, the conservative response is to refine, not to dismantle. Take the George Floyd killing of 2020. People across the moral and political spectrum rightly condemned what happened on that day. But the conservative response to that would be to ask what went wrong with the law and what went wrong with that policing. Not to get rid of policing wholesale. Our response to that would be, that's juvenile, that's idiotic, and it creates more problems than it resolves. So perhaps there are three things above all that define the conservative perspective. The first one is the idea of learning from the past and not repeating mistakes. In other words, conserving the best of what humanity has achieved. And that is the difference between wanting slow evolution of ideas and institutions rather than violent revolution imposed by radicals. Second idea, impartial rule of law. That is a massively important one to the conservative mindset. Not subjective identity politics, which is partial, biased, and up to human judgments, which change over time according to fads and trends. We argue that social justice is therefore the opposite of justice. You can have one or you can have the other, but you cannot have both simultaneously. They are mutually incompatible. And the third, and perhaps the greatest fundamental bulwark of the conservative ideal, is the inviolability of the individual. Conservative politics and beliefs hold that the individual is sacrosanct, best expressed as an end in themselves, not a means. And for that reason, conservative politics is very incredibly anti-social engineering. People are not there to be tools. They are not there to be used by a government. They're not part of a narrative. They're not part of a story that a politician is trying to achieve. They are free. They are inviolable, and the law is structured in that way. In far left countries, the law is not structured in that way. What's different about that is it is collectivist. And under such a regime, it's taken that the good of the group outweighs the primacy or the sanctity of the individual. And this is often expressed in phrases like a little discomfort for the individual for the greater good. I argue that that is the formula for genocide. And indeed, it's why I write books like Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. So, what is right wing? Well, first you have to understand that the propaganda technique from communist nations, used for the better part of a century, is to label anything that is to the right of a Marxist communist dictatorship as either fascist or right-wing. So by this standard, you are either a wonderful communist who cares about the masses, or you are an evil right-wing fascist. There's nothing else. There's nothing in between. And of course, this is something that the liberal media, who are going further and further to the left, tend to do quite regularly. Anything that doesn't fall into their political camp, which is moving to the left, is obviously fascist or obviously Nazist or obviously right-wing, because they say so. So be careful with the terminology. But as much as radical leftists would hate to hear this, the real, actual radical right-wing is the same as the radical left-wing in one important respect. In both cases, they indulge in the most dangerous formula for social organization, and the one that leads inexorably to genocide. And that is quite simply the prioritization of the group over the individual. One is economic class, eliminate the bourgeoisie, up with the workers. And the other is racial class, eliminate the racially impure, whether that means in their language the Jews, the Tutsis, the Armenians, and up with our race. In both cases, it's about the group and the primacy of the group over the sanctity and inviolability of the individual. So much of this boils down to one important metric. And in fact, if you had to split up the political spectrum from left to right and ask, where's the tipping point? Where does it change? The tipping point is the difference between group or individual. I argue passionately, because I think it's important and we need to learn these lessons from history, that when you go over onto group side at the cost of the individual, you set the conditions for disaster. On the other side of that, the sanctity and inviolability of the individual is the precursor for peace and human flourishing. I believe that. I believe it passionately. It's why I write for it. It's why I fight for it. And essentially, that's what the two different sides of the spectrum break down into. Is it about group first, or is it about individual first? Free individuals under the rule of law, the classical liberal or the current conservative system, I think that's the ideal way forward. That's a quick introduction to the different viewpoints, the different ideologies. If you're interested in this sort of topic matter, please do subscribe to the site. I'm Douglas Kruger, author of the global new book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good.